and I think Brother Bush is going to be taking class next week, so we'll won't be studying this then. But in our study last week, we'd gotten down to Isaiah 17 and verse 14. The context goes back to verse 12, and going through verse 14, it's dealing with the fall of Assyria. Not Syria, but Assyria. And there is a woe placed upon them. In verse 13, he is saying forth, the nations shall rush like the rushing of mighty waters, but God shall rebuke them. They shall flee far off. They shall be chased as the chaff of the mountains before the wind, like a rolling thing before the whirlwind. And so here's Assyria coming down through, and like a rushing mighty water, just destroying everything in its path. But God's going to rebuke them, and they will be chased off, and they're going to flee. So verse 14, he says, and behold, at eventime, trouble, and before the morning he is not. This is the portion of them that spoil us, and the lot of them that rob us. The two phrases dealing with the eventide or evening tide trouble, the morning he is not, is exactly how God dealt with the Assyrians. At eventide, they go to bed. In the morning, 185,000 soldiers are dead, so he is not in that situation. They have died. Might turn over to 2 Kings chapter 19. And in verses 35 through verse 37, it really sets this forth when it says that it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshiping in the house of Nishrod, his god, that Adramelech and Sheresh, his sons, smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia, and Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his stead. So here they are, they go to bed, evening tide, but before the morning comes, they are all, these 185,000 of them, dead. But the latter part of this is the portion of them that spoil us and the lot of them that rob us. What he's saying here is that God is going to deal in this manner, not the exact way, but in this manner, anyone who would rob or spoil Israel or Judah. Turn over to 2 Kings chapter 18. And in verses 13 through verse 16 of 2 Kings 18, it says, Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria to Lachish, saying, I have offered, return from me that which thou puttest on me will I bear. There's the robbing. Whatever you put upon me, I'll bear it. I'll pay it. And the king of Assyria appointed unto Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house. So here's Sennacherib and the Assyrian army, and here's Hezekiah saying, whatever you put on us, whatever taxes you impose, we'll pay it. Just return or leave. And so there's the 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold. Well, how do you come up with it? Have to go into the temple and rob the temple. So this is the portion. This is what happens when you spoil Israel or Judah, the lot of them that rob us. That's what they had tried to do.
That's why I don't understand why they're always looking for the Ark of the Covenant today.
The Ark of the Covenant today. Well, you have people looking for that today, as well as the Noah's Ark and the wood from the ark, the holy, all of these things, all of these relics. Let me preface it by saying first that I believe God in His providence destroyed all of those things. Now, why? That's exactly it. Man, if you look at what man does, he ends up worshiping objects like that. Roman Catholic Church is a great illustration of that, isn't it? With all of the idols and relics that they have, and people end up worshiping. Shroud of Turin is worshipped today. And if anyone really thinks that that's the burial cloth of Jesus, I've got some prime land to sell you. It's well, and that's because people worship things like that. So I believe God in His providence destroyed all of those things to prevent that very thing.
What they was doing to the brazen serpent, they was worshiping that thing.
Same thing. The brazen serpent that Moses erected to save people from the snake bites. And people worshiped that, so it was finally destroyed. That's the nature of man. But people searching for that, it is a feeble attempt. How would you prove, let's just say, for some unreasonable way that someone actually came across some wood that was from the ark? Prove it. There's no way that you can prove it. If you get some gold and it's claimed to be from the temple, how you know that it came from the temple? There's what, Dale? There's no way in which you can prove these things.
The hardest thing I think they could ever find is that cup. Supposedly, Jesus drank out of it. It never says in the Bible He drank. He said, I won't drink this cup with you. He did drink.
There you're getting into the one cup discussion. The cup that Jesus used in the Last Supper, And those who say that God authorized the cup, let me change that. God authorized the container, because he does speak about the cup, but he uses that for the contents of the cup, not the container. But they're talking about the container. Okay, that's the... this would actually be, I think, metonymy. Not synecdoche. Because it is what the cup contains, not the actual container. Well, if the container itself is what is authorized, then the argument goes, and I don't really know how it is avoided, that you better find the actual container that Jesus used. Why would it authorize some other container if the container itself was authorized? So that's the argument that's being used. And of course,
I was just talking about archaeology. They call it Holy Grail.
the Holy Grail. The container that Jesus supposedly drank from during that Last Supper. And there's no way to find that. Again, you have the same type of situation. God through his providence destroys all of these things.
Indiana Jones found that and dropped it in
Well, I didn't watch the Indiana Jones movie, so I really can't speak about that. So he found it, and it fell down into the earth. Okay, well, see there, it's gone. It's destroyed. So, no. But that's what they did in order to pay the tribute to Sennacherib. Okay, Carl.
How would everybody in the church use that cup?
Well, that would be the other thing, which follows from the aspect of if the container is authorized, then you first have to get the container that Jesus used. Then second, you have to spread it all around the world. And in one day, and everyone has to drink from that one container. So how are you going to accomplish that? But we have a lot of brethren still who argue strenuously for one cup being used at the Lord's Supper. And if you read Luke's account of that situation, it says that he says, divide it among yourselves. How'd they divide it if it's one container that's authorized? Not if it's one container, though. Well, that's why I'm pointing this out, to show that no, they did not use one container. They divided it among themselves. And what? That's the whole point, Dale, that I'm making. You divide it, that is, you now have multiple containers, which is exactly what we use. So, but that's getting back, we've gotten off the subject as to Hezekiah goes in. He takes the gold and the silver from the temple in order to pay the taxes that Sennacherib had placed upon them. And so that's the idea of spoiling us and robbing us, the taking of those taxes by Sennacherib upon Hezekiah. And this is going to be a lot of that. Someone messing with my mouse. There. So now then, chapter 18. And in chapter 18, the first 3 verses is, and I titled it, Ethiopia is Gravely Threatened. In verse 1, he says, "Woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia." Wayne Jackson wrote, kind of as a background to this, that this section is an oracle regarding this section is an oracle regarding Ethiopia. As noted in the introductory chapter, Palestine was sandwiched between Egypt in the southwest and Assyria in the northeast. So you have Assyria, and Egypt, and Palestine's right between them. He goes on, Assyria loomed as a threat on Israel's eastern horizon. So, or hence, there was a temptation to form an alliance with Egypt and her neighbors for protection rather than trusting in God as their Savior. Now, what he's saying is, here's Assyria, Egypt, here's Palestine. Assyria is the main threat, so what do? They go down to Egypt and those nations and form an alliance to prevent Assyria from coming against them. Now, they were very interested in that because if the fight can be kept north of them, they don't have to worry too much about Assyria. So that's the temptation. Go down to Egypt, make an alliance with them. He goes on, this section appears to address a time when Ethiopia had sent an envoy to Jerusalem to discuss a possible military confederation for protection against Assyria. Scholars are divided as to whether the threat was that of Sargon's invasion or what is more likely the latter conquest of Sennacherib. So here's Ethiopia. They've sent some ambassadors, or it's going to be messengers, verse 2, ambassadors, to Judah to form an alliance in order to prevent the advance of Assyria. And that would, of course, be for Ethiopian, their own protection. Keep the Assyrians north of them, keep them in Judah, and if we can defeat them there, then we're safe. Good strategy. Woe here, like it says, woe to the land, shadowing with wings, is not so much a curse, not in this case, but instead it's a cry of despair from the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Here's despair on their part, kind of like woe is me, as we would express it. Many times woe is a cry or is a curse upon someone, placing a curse upon them that something bad's going to happen. This is more despair on the part of Jerusalem. Possibly it's a call for them to hear the prophetic announcement regarding the destruction of their enemies. Their enemies are going to be destroyed, as we have just noticed in the preceding chapter. But they needed to hear that. Needed to take heed, to listen to what the prophets have been telling you, or are telling you, about this that's coming. The illusion of the shadowing with wings is basically a swarm of buzzing flies, tsetse flies, which abound in Ethiopia. And it mentions the land beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. Probably there's 3 rivers that are dealt with: the White Nile, the Blue Nile, and Attabara. Those are the rivers that it's probably dealing with and extending southward. So in verse 2, he adds that sendeth Uh-oh. Let me get back to where I was. And I can't find the right version now. I went one side or the other. There we go. In my Logos program, which this is, I have no telling how many Bibles. And if you go use the arrow keys to go from one version to another version, and so if you start going one way, you can get away from the version you're using real quick, which is what I was doing, and I didn't know which one I touched really. So, verse 2 then, that sendeth ambassadors by the sea, even in vessels of bulrushes upon the waters, saying, Go, ye swift messengers, to a nation scattered and peeled, to a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden down, whose land the rivers have spoiled. So they have sent ambassadors to Jerusalem, and as in all probability this is during the time of Sennacherib, and his general is Tirhakah, and his threats upon Jerusalem. It says that they were sent in vessels of bulrushes upon the waters. These vessels of bulrushes would be fast-moving papyrus boats, and then pitch on them to prevent water from coming in. And can I just add here, kind of as an aside, they were using pitch. What would pitch indicate? Yeah, it was used in the ark. It seals water, keeps out water, but if you have pitch, what do you have? Oil. It is stated that the Standard Oil Company went to that area to to get oil because pitch that it was recorded of in the Bible. And they knew if they were using pitch, then there's got to be oil. Thus, they went over to those areas, and guess what they found? They found the oil and made some of those people very rich. But you could say, how did they know that there was, or why was there pitch there? And why would they use that in the Bible? Other than they knew what it would do, but it gives indication of the oil that we find, and thus shows the accuracy of the Bible. If they had gone over there and there had not been any oil, then there might have been some difficulties. But there's been plenty of oil there. But these were very fast-moving boats made of papyrus, daubed with pitch, and thus they were swift messengers, and messengers that are scattered and peeled. And I don't know Hebrew, so I really can't say, but from what I've read, this is a very difficult phrase to translate. Thus you'd probably, if I went through all of those versions I started flipping through a while ago, you would find some differences as far as translation is concerned. Possibly it's bronze-skinned or satin-skinned and smooth-shaven. And it characterized the Ethiopians possibly as tall, smooth-skinned people. Isaiah tells them, basically, go back home, go back to where you came from, because we're not going to form any alliance with you. It says that these people were a people terrible from the beginning hitherto. Pulpit commentary says, and it's a little bit of a longer reading, but concerning these people, that, quote, the Israelites first knew the Ethiopians as soldiers when they formed a part of the army brought by Shishak against Rehoboam about BC 970, 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 3. They had afterwards experience in their vast numbers when Zerah made his attack upon Asa. But on this occasion they succeeded in defeating them. 2 Chronicles 14, verses 9 through 13. It was not till about 2 centuries after this that the power of Ethiopia began to be really formidable to Egypt. And the, quote, miserable Cushites, end quote, as they had been in the habit of calling them, acquired the preponderating influence of the valley of the Nile. And under Pionka, Shabak, and Tirhaka reduced Israel to subjection. Isaiah perhaps refers to their rise under Pihaka as their beginning. End quote. Basically, the point to that is that he's saying they were terrible from the beginning, probably from this time of Pianka. And if anybody wants the spelling of that, it's Piankhi. From his time. But from even going back from the first introduction we have of them in relationship to being a part of the army that Shishak brings in 2 Chronicles 12:3, they were part of that. And so that would be the introduction of it. But even at that point in time, they would have been a terrible people. A nation that meted out and trodden down the lands the rivers have spoiled. So they were powerful people who had trod down others, and the land was spoiled or cut up by the Nile. So in verse 3 then, we have all ye inhabitants of the world and dwellers on the earth, see ye when he lifteth up his ensign on the mountains, and when he bloweth a trumpet, hear ye. Here's a call to the entire world. All ye inhabitants of the world, all the dwellers on the earth. Pretty universal call, isn't it? To do what? Look and see what God is about to do. And this is dealing with God's actions when the Assyrians lift up their ensign on the mountains. They're basically their ensign, their banner on the mountain, and they blow the trumpet as a signal for their attack upon Jerusalem. And Isaiah is saying all of the earth needs to look and see what God's going to do to them. And that again goes back to what we mentioned a moment ago that they go to bed, and when they wake up, 185,000 of their soldiers are dead. If you live back then, and that takes place, what would you think about someone saying, well, let's go invade Jerusalem now? You going to think twice about that? It's probably going to be, let's stay away from there. Go someplace else. So all of the world needs to pay attention. We don't need Ethiopia's help because we have God. And God's going to take care of it. And so you look and see what God says, what God's going to do. Then in verses 4 through verse 7, we have Ethiopia's deliverance will turn them toward Jerusalem, or toward Jehovah. In verse 4 he says, For so the Lord said unto me, I will take my rest, and I will consider in my dwelling place like a clear heat upon the herbs, and like a cloud of dew in the heat of the harvest. God says basically he's not panicking about the invasion. The Lord says, I'm going to take my rest. I'm going to consider in my dwelling place like a cedar upon the herbs, like a cloud of dew in the heat of the harvest. I'm not worried about this. I'm going to take it easy. And God is saying, I'm going to wait for the Wait for the harvest to come, or for it to ripen. God knows what the result's going to be, and God also knows when it's going to be. So he doesn't have to concern himself. He doesn't have to be worried about it. And so he's taking his rest in heaven, his dwelling place. Wayne Jackson wrote that his majesty glows like shimmering heat in the sunshine, and his benevolence is as a dewy mist in the heat of the harvest time. God knows it all. We can learn a little bit about the nature of God in that, of course, that God doesn't have to tell, or does not have to wait and see about tomorrow, because God already knows about tomorrow. Okay, Dale?
You can kind of get the dramatization of this and personalize it by turning to First Kings 22, somewhere around 15 or 16, where Micaiah was saying about the Spirit in heaven and about the Lord, and saying what was going to happen with Ahab and Joshua, what was going to happen with this, that, and the other detail about it. Give the details.
You have the same type of principle there, but you'd have that in any prophecy, that God is telling you of the future, what's going to happen. God knows it, and God can reveal it to us, which is what he is doing. And he's saying, you don't need to worry about it, even as he's not. Pulpit commentary states that God waits while the influences of heat and moisture, sunshine and dew, his own agencies, ripen Assyria's scheme, impassive, taking no part. Then suddenly, he takes the part described in the latter portion of verse 5 and cuts off the shoots and hews down the branches, like a clear heat upon herbs, etc. Rather, while there is clear heat in the sunshine, while there is a cloud of dew in the harvest warmth, while surrounding influences are such as must favor the growth of Assyria's power and pride. So here's their power, their pride being grown and cultivated, and then God's going to cut it off. So God knows what's going to happen. Now then, consider yourself, for example, in Jerusalem at this time. Here comes these ambassadors from Ethiopia, and you know the strength and power of Ethiopia, and saying, we want to make an alliance with you. What would the temptation be? Let's make an alliance with them. They're strong, they're powerful, they can help us against Assyria. And God's basically, or Isaiah saying to the ambassadors from Ethiopia, go back home, we don't need your help. Why? Because God's going to take care of the situation. He's just letting Assyria get to that point where they are ready to be harvested. And he's going to harvest them in that sense by destroying 185,000 soldiers. So we don't need Ethiopia's help. Now then, if you were in Jerusalem, though, and you're thinking, you're kind of worried. Wouldn't you be worried if here's the most powerful nation and they got all these soldiers and they've come to Jerusalem and they're planning on destroying you? Wouldn't you be concerned about that?
Not if you were familiar with the 10 plagues of Egypt, you know.
Well, but we're talking about, Dale, we're talking about from a physical standpoint right now. Yes, you're going to be concerned. You're going to be worried about it. And God is saying, there's no reason to be. Because I'm going to take care of the problem. I'm going to take care of the situation. I'll destroy them, and they'll run back home. And so you don't need all of the alliances that you might want to make. Don't need them. They need to go back home to their own nation. Because God's going to take care of it. We'll stop there and in a couple of weeks then, I guess. We'll start with verse 5.